All right, folks. Okay, guys. Hey, Nancy. We thank you guys so much for coming. We are going to get started, and hopefully everybody online can hear me. I'm going to kind of keep my eye out for the chat in case folks can't hear me. As you guys know, we are still continuing to juggle our virtual and our in-person spaces. So thank you guys so much for joining us in person today. And for the folks that have chimed in online, thank you as well. My name is Rachel Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of the Glen Environmental Coalition. Something to Chew On is a part of our monthly education event series. So we have these events every month on different topics around either cultural history, natural history, research, just around coastal Georgia issues as a whole. In part of our response to some of the air quality concerns in Brunswick earlier this year, we decided that it would be great to host an outreach opportunity with the Environmental Protection Division and staff from their air protection branch. So I'll introduce them in just a minute and also just kind of give them an opportunity to tell them a little bit more about themselves. But I did want to go ahead and start off with some updates on things that we're working on right now. So we've been following the trust fund honesty resolution for a very long time, a number of years. This has actually been something that has been worked on in the state of Georgia in the legislature for over 10 years, closer to 15 years. And we have some really awesome news. We shared some really awesome news back in November after the general election. Amendment 1 was passed to restore trust in our solid waste and hazardous waste trust funds. And the second part of that was actually the individual amendments of those bills, which is HB 511. It passed the House unanimously in March, and then subsequently passed the Senate unanimously as well. No nay votes on either one. So that is a really strong, strong solidarity from our Capitol, which in this time are seemingly lots of contentious issues up there. We found something we could all agree on, which is restoring trust and transparency in our trust funds in the state of Georgia. So we've sealed the deal. Georgians spoke, our legislators have spoke on what that means is more money from the state is going to actually go towards environmental cleanups and our hazardous waste trust fund program and our solid waste trust fund program for cleanups like some of the ongoing work that we have in Glen County on T Street landfill. That is one of our state designated hazardous waste sites. And the state does have to utilize some funds to oversee those cleanups. So some of the money will be dedicated to that purpose. And then some of the other important fees are the tire fees that everyone pays when you get rid of a tire. That will go to tire reclamation programs throughout the state and other types of amnesty days that our local cities can put on. So we're really excited about that. There is an action item. Our work never ends. We always like to thank our legislators when things turn out in our favor. And again, with a lot of really contentious things going on in the Capitol, I think it's important that we celebrate our wins and we thank our legislators for our wins. So reach out to your representatives, reach out to your senators, and the bill is on its way to getting signed by the governor. So if you feel like it, you can also send him a note and just make sure you express your interest and your advocate for him signing it. But again, with 0 no votes in both the House and the Senate, there should not be any issues with it getting past his desk. Oops. So some other news, our SPLOST vote took place on March 16th, and beforehand, the Glen County voters have spoken. There were over 6,500 votes were cast. though that is less than 12% of the registered voters in Glenn County. And the main reason why we point that out is just kind of a little bit of voter apathy in that election. So, you know, we need to do a better job of getting out the vote, even in our March or May elections, okay? Those elections that people usually don't show up to. We have to remember that in order for our democracy to work, people have to show up to vote all the time. So now that thus lost failed, what's next? So we are going to be working to try to coordinate some county and city town halls in each district with the city and the county commission. This will help increase public participation. I know that there was a lot of residents in our work around SPLOST 2021 around public participation. There was a lot of community members that felt like the project list had been proposed without a lot of community involvement. So we do believe that if the city county commissioners work together to host town halls and get public feedback in between now and when they propose their next SPLOST list, that it will be more likely to succeed. And with that, we also want to see discussion around climate projects, specifically around planning for some of the challenges that our community is going to be facing in the realm of climate change. There's a lot of federal dollars that are available through FEMA hazard mitigation grants, and SPLOST could be a way to plan for those programs and also leverage some of those federal dollars. So we really want to help. We've actually been in contact with folks with the Nature Conservancy, who has a local climate resilience specialist, and our UGA office as well, trying to pull together some of our stakeholders to start having those discussions with our city and our county commission to make sure climate focused projects get included on the next list. And then of course, the last big what's next is advocating for traffic improvements at the Sea Island Causeway and Frederica Road intersection without encroaching on our 96-year-old Twitty Park. We are hoping to celebrate its birthday again this year. Last year was actually its 95th year. It was 95 years old, but of course we were in the middle of a pandemic in July, and some of the highest rates of COVID in our county were in the middle of July. So we didn't have any celebrations, but we are hoping to have a picnic in honor of this public space sometime this year, either this summer or maybe when it cools off a little bit more in the fall. And hopefully things are a little bit more back to normal as our community continues to get vaccinated. We do still have an active public participation opportunity. I noticed I still have the date from the March 31st public meeting on here. The comment period ends for the Hercules Pinova hazardous waste permit modification, and that ends on May 10th. We are hoping to do some outreach with the city and the county. We actually sent some emails about that this week. We've got our partners 100 Miles that are going to be working on that as well. And our goal is to get a lot of our local citizens to submit comments on some of the concerns around the corrective action plan or the cleanup plan. And then also having our city and our county and some of our state representatives weighing in on that decision as well. So between now and May 10th, we're just over a month away. We were graciously given a 90-day comment period, which gives our community a lot of time to get their voice out. And so we are hoping to have a good response and good community participation in that public comment period. Their website, herculesbrunswick.com, is listed at the bottom of this slide. The corrective action plan or the cleanup plan is hosted there. And there's also some more information about when that comment period ends. Again, that's May 10th. And then who we're going to be submitting comments to. Somebody who works for the EPD as well, but a different part of their program. Okay, and last few little updates. We have a lot of events this month. This is actually our second event in April. We were at Historic Downtown First Friday last Friday. We have next Saturday, we have a chemical water quality workshop. That's going to be at the chapel in Brunswick, which is located next to Wake Up Coffee. And then the following Saturday, April 24th, we have a bacterial workshop that morning as well. So if you're interested in either renewing your water quality certification or becoming one of our certified water quality volunteers, you can participate in those. They are free to attend. It's a short program followed by actually walking through some of the water quality tests. And then we have a little quality control quiz that we give out at the end to make sure that all of our volunteers understand the standards around and our protocols, if you will, around collecting water quality, so that all the water quality we collect is of the same standard. And then lastly, Earth Day. And then I'm going to hand it off to our speakers. We have a huge day planned for Earth Day. Last year, we had high hopes of having an extravagant celebration for our planet and the people that live on it. But unfortunately, the pandemic pretty much ruined any concept of an idea of having any events on Earth Day, though we did actually end up, we had a virtual webinar with 100 Miles last year. But this year, we're going all out. We know that a lot of people are stir crazy. They've been stuck at home for a while. A lot of people are getting vaccinated as well. And so people are just kind of overall more comfortable getting out. That said, we are still going to obviously be following our CDC guidelines for safe gathering, masks, social distancing, especially inside. But we have a ton of events going on, starting with two that actually aren't even on here. We have confirmed a cleanup with Satilla Marsh Elementary. This is not a public event, but we're really excited that they are interested in gathering their students and parents on their campus to do a little cleanup around their school. We also are coordinating a cleanup with the Coastal College of Georgia Athletic Department, the location to be determined. But we're really excited about getting their students involved in a little environmental action and taking part in celebrating Earth Day with the Glen Environmental Coalition. We have a fundraiser. This is our Eat for a Cause. So all day, 10% of the proceeds made by Brumelli Boys Pizzeria will actually get donated back to the Glen Environmental Coalition. So if you're planning on having lunch or going out for lunch, be sure to get lunch at Brumelli's. But don't worry, because they will also be at our afternoon events as well, at our Earth Day action party, which I'll swing back around to that in just a second. But our Earth Day evening of celebration starts with a climate justice film screening called Revisioning, I'm gonna get it wrong. It's a little bit of a tongue twister. Revisioning Recovery, which talks a lot about low income and marginalized communities, how they are disproportionately at risk due to the challenges that are faced by climate change. There is a series of short films that walk through some of the impacts of Hurricane Maria in the Caribbean islands, some of the impacts of some heat waves that happened in Chicago that caused a number of people to die, unfortunately. And it just kind of walks through, it's a little doom and gloom, but don't worry, because we're gonna follow that up with an immediate way for people to take action, which is to march for our planet and march for climate action in our community. The march will start immediately after the film screening, and we'll march downtown Newcastle to Silver Bluff Brewery. And once we get there, we have our Earth Day action party. So we have some vendors, commercial vendors that have sustainable, eco-friendly products. We will have a henna booth, which is kind of just like a unique little fun kind of eco-fair thing that we added to this event to try to make it a little bit more family friendly. And then we have action stations that 100 Miles and GEC cultivated, so that again, at the end of all of this, people can go home and they have celebrated Earth Day, they have taken action for our planet and the people that rely on our cultural and natural resources. And with that, it's like just such a mouthful, but it is Earth Day and we are so excited that we can have these events, and we just have to celebrate this one day for our planet. to the greatest extent possible. And I think we're certainly doing that. So I have to be honest, I might be a little in over my head on that day, but we're going to work it out. We've got volunteers that are going to help us out, and it's going to be a great day. So with that, I'm going to exit my screen share here, and I'm going to introduce our two speakers. So we have Dika Kuoh, who is the Air Protection Branch Chief, and I'm going to let him introduce himself a little bit more thoroughly, and then also Eric Cornwell, who is with the stationary permitting program. And so I'm going to just turn it over to you guys so you can take it away. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So hopefully you all can see this. Okay. So I'd like to make a quick correction that I'm the assistant branch chief. Just to clarify, my name is Dika Kuoh. Happy to be here. I'm just going to breeze through these slides because I know we have a lot to get to today, and you'll probably have questions for us. So just wanted to do an overview of the air branch by numbers. So we have about over 3,000 active air permits in the state of Georgia, and Eric's probably going to delve into this a little bit more. Of those, we have about 353 major sources. That's where we spent the most of our time in terms of our regulatory oversight. We also have 758 synthetic minor sources, which are essentially sources that, you know, took a limit to not be a major source, but they're pretty big as well. So those are where we spend the vast majority of our time addressing emissions from stationary sources. Then we have a vehicle emissions testing program. We test about over 3 million vehicles in the 13 county Atlanta metro area every year. 835 inspection stations where we certify the machines used to do the testing, and then 2,500 testers, inspectors that really do the tests that are certified by us. We have 34 air quality monitoring sites spread throughout the state of Georgia. We monitor up to 200 different pollutants in those different sites. We have 145 employees at the Air Protection Branch, which is one of the 3 branches within EPD. So you have the Air Branch, Land Branch, and the Watershed Branch. And then finally, this is kind of an aside, it's less related to air, but we do also regulate radioactive material users. So we give licenses for that. It could be labs, research facilities, and the like. Folks that use radioactive materials want to make sure they dispose of them properly and handle them properly. So wanted to do an overview of what we do. First, we monitor air quality, as I said, 34 different sites. There's a lot involved in monitoring. The first is making sure the monitors are working properly, that they're properly calibrated, that they're collecting data under the right conditions. We validate the data to make sure the data is of the highest quality, and then we share the data through AirNow, which is a database managed by EPA that allows everybody to share air quality information throughout the country in one designated database where everybody has access. Once we collect that data, that monitoring data, we have to figure out what do we do with that data. Sometimes we figure out, okay, we want to issue a rule to address a pollution issue, or we develop state plans that we submit to EPA to say, okay, if we're not meeting, say, the ozone standard, what is our plan to meet the ozone standard? We have emissions inventories. That's kind of breaking down where are the emissions coming from? Is it coming from certain sectors of industry, or is it coming from vehicles? You know, trying to break down where the possible emissions are coming from to explain why we measured a high level here or there. And then modeling, you know, to be able to demonstrate, whether it's the EPA or in our planning that we're going in the right direction, we develop models to project ourselves in the future and say, well, if we do all these measures, these rules, this is what it looks like in the future. But then we can circle back later and verify that our models were accurate. This is the nitty-gritty, and it's the implementation of the regulation. Eric is going to talk about this, you know, permits, you know, how do we indicate to facilities day-to-day what they need to do in order to comply with state and federal regulations and address the pollution that we measured. Licensing is more of a radiation thing. And then certification of mobile sources, that's the vehicle testing programs that we have. Compliance insurance is also part of that implementation process, but it's verifying that the facilities are doing what their permit says. A lot of this inspection activity is not only done by us, but your district office folks as well are very involved in that as well. Also responding to complaints, trying to figure out what could be wrong, doing audits of our programs and making sure our programs are doing what they're intending, what we intended them to do. And then verifying that, making sure that everything we implemented has results here in the monitoring world, making sure that the pollution is dropped as well. So today I want to talk about some of the data we found, the air trends, not only in Georgia, but in your specific area. We're going to discuss some of the emissions inventories, where some of these emissions, what we're seeing, and then Eric's going to talk about our permitting process with a little bit more detail. So before we get started, I want to break down two major buckets of air pollutants for discussion here. The very first bucket is the criteria air pollutants. Those are the pollutants that have a national ambient air quality standards. Only these 6 pollutants have that. So these are standards that apply to every single state all across the country for these pollutants. And we monitor these pollutants all year round to make sure that, not all year round, but we monitor most of them all year round to make sure that we're complying with this national ambient air quality standard. The second bucket is the hazardous air pollutants. Those don't have a national ambient air quality standard. We call them HAPs or air toxics sometimes. What they are actually a list. There's an official list, about 187 HAPs under the Clean Air Act that EPA regulates, and then we regulate as well under the Clean Air Act. So those don't have a national ambient air quality standards, but they have specific Clean Air Act regulation that apply to certain industries. Some of those could be, forcing somebody to install controls for certain types of equipment. It could be at the manufacturer level, setting manufacturer standards. It could be work practice standards, but there are a bunch of rules that are sector specific, industry specific under the Clean Air Act that we kind of end up rolling into our permits. So this is a map. We said 34 different locations. I wanted to highlight the 2 locations that are nearest to you all on the coast. You got 2 monitors here and 1 monitor here in Brunswick. So looking at the first criteria pollutant, ozone, ground level ozone, this is really, it's not one that's emitted in the air, but it's the product of a photochemical reaction in the atmosphere, but it's something we can measure. And so when we measure all of these 34 sites, all these different monitors, we see that if we look at the latest standard, which is the 2015 ozone standard, which is 70 parts per billion, all of the sites all across the state have gotten better, and you see a drop here. The site that's borderline here is Atlanta. Atlanta has a lot of traffic. The weather conditions are such that Atlanta has always struggled to meet the ozone standard, but we're actually meeting it at this particular point in time, which is very exciting. So if we drill down to your area, in Brunswick and Savannah, which are the closest monitors to you all, you see you all have always performed really well with respect to the standard. You're below the standard and you continue to drop there below the standard. So a lot of good results there on the coast with respect to ozone. If we look at sulfur dioxide, statewide, same thing, we've seen a downward trend in sulfur dioxide at the locations where we do monitor for sulfur dioxide. We've seen that once again here, if you look at your area, you're below the standard, the current standard of sulfur dioxide in Savannah. We only monitor sulfur dioxide in Savannah. So fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, really fine, super fine dust, so fine that you can't see it. Fine particulate matter here, same thing, downward trend for everybody. Atlanta being the one that's on the top again. But if we drill down to your area here, Savannah and Brunswick in a good place with respect to the standard of PM 2.5. So PM 2.5 has 2 standards. One is annual, one is 24 hour. The difference there is 24 hours more like a peak event. Like, if you have a massive wildfire, you'll see a peak or something like that. So there, again, everybody's below the standard there all across the state. In your particular area, very low here. This is just for your information, and I'm sure I'll be sharing this presentation with Rachel later that she can then share with you all. But this is just if you wanted to go to our website and wanted to see the data for yourself. This is the data on the coast. You can go there to airgeorgia.org. There's a drop down here that allows you to pick, this is AQI, which means air quality index, but you can pick ozone, you can pick other pollutants. There are reports there in the report section, our annual report, kind of explaining some of the stuff that we do, and pollutants. You know, you want a breakdown of what the pollutants are, learn more about the individual pollutants. So I just invite you to go to our website and check it out. So CAP stands for criteria air pollutants. That's the first bucket we discussed. Just wanted to talk about general trends here to show that overall, over the last 20 years, there's been a slow decline in all of the criteria air pollutants. And we can delve in later if you have questions about why that is happening, but you can see there a good general trend downward all across the state of Georgia for criteria air pollutants. If we drill down to Glynn County, you can see a similar trend here. Now, I want to alert you all to this little peak here is not a change in environmental activity. What this is the calculation they use to estimate dust emissions from construction for PM10 changed. So the method changed, which caused this artificial bump up here. You can see that PM 2.5, the method did not change all that much, so it stayed pretty flat. But so this is not a result of any change in activity. It was more of a result of the way it was calculated. But you can see downward trend here all the way through. So if we break it down for Glynn County, you can kind of see a similar pattern here, just downward trend, a CO dropping significantly year to year, NOx dropping a little bit, and so on and so forth. All these are the pollutants. So this is carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, all of the criteria air pollutants. But you can see the CO there has dropped quite a bit. And we can talk about why that is as well. So if you look at all the criteria pollutants, the top 10 counties, Glynn is somewhere is 18th, so it doesn't make the top 10 list there. But you can see that most of the emissions from criteria air pollutants happens in and around the metro Atlanta area, Fulton County, Cobb, DeKalb, Gwinnett. All these are part of that 13 county or area around the city, largely due to, I'd say, transportation, traffic, things like that. Bartow County here, Plant Bowen power plant contributes a lot there. Okay, so TRI is a toxic release inventory. It's like a database where companies go in on EPA's database and essentially submit information about their toxic releases. So some of them are, it's kind of multimedia there. But if you look at Georgia, companies have self-reported a decrease over time of the emissions from their toxic release inventory database. Stack emissions versus fugitive, the difference there is, a stack it sticks out there and it's usually tied to equipment. Fugitive is more stuff that kind of just leaves the building, seeps out. It could be the use of solvents and things like that don't necessarily get captured. But the big contribution here, the emissions has been from the stacks, but you can see that contribution is decreased over time. If you look at Glynn County specifically, same thing. It follows more or less that Georgia-wide trend where you see a slow decrease in stack emissions over time. Yeah, if you have any questions there, we can discuss that. Top 10 TRI, Glynn County is the 10th in the emissions for TRI, self-reported information from companies that submit to the toxic release inventory. Most of it is stack related, as you can see here, probably industrial in nature. So if you have any questions, there's a lot of contact information. There's a directory here. You can just click, and then this is our Air Branch main page. So I kind of talk fast, so if you, that's going to be it for now. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
I have a
I'm looking at the chat here. I don't see any
Sorry.
questions in the chat.
This is Rachel. I do have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
There was the one slide that had the SO2, the sulfur dioxide for Bartow County, and it was kind of like significantly lower of a band county. And I was just kind of curious.
Yeah, I think what that was is I know that we had asked Georgia Power installed these scrubbers to scrub out sulfur dioxide emissions from the burning of coal. It's very possible that those controls that got installed at Bowen impacted that Bartow County number and caused that massive decrease in sulfur dioxide is my guess as to what happened there. Yeah, there was a period where I think in the I want to say 20, I forgot if it's 2011 or it was like a 10-year period where all of these power plants had to install scrubbers. It's like additional controls at the back end of their coal combustion units that reduces sulfur dioxide emissions. This was a Georgia rule. It was not a federal rule, but it's a Georgia rule we put in place. Does that answer your question or?
Yes, it does. And we've got one more question from the audience. I'm going to have him share it and then I'll repeat it to the mic here.
Sure.
So the question is his understanding that Glynn County used to have more ambient air quality monitor equipment previously, and I guess they have decreased over the years. And so can you comment on that? And then
Sure.
I guess just like what the current status of ambient air quality monitoring, which I know you kind of hinted at, but if you don't mind just kind of reiterating what's being monitored here in Glynn County right now.
Sure. So we started off with a network that was much larger, it's true. Based on the pollution level, we cite these monitors. Now, if we're not reading any number that's very high, and I think that's what happened in a lot of these coastal monitors we had, we were not registering anything in terms of the numbers. And so when you register negligible amounts of pollution for such a long time, EPA, says, there's no need in spending your resources on that specific location since we really haven't seen an uptick. If you see a high number in other areas, then you have to increase your concentration of sites in that specific area to try to understand that. But so it's kind of like you got an initial screening tool. You're trying to feel your way into where to put your monitors, and you tend to put them where the higher pollution measurements are recorded.
And just to add to, through our response and our communication with the Environmental Protection Division, there is still ozone, and I believe maybe one other parameter that might be particulate matter. That's what that PM stands for. That's correct. Being monitored here in Brunswick. But some of the other parameters that were here historically are when he was talking about the toxic released inventories. So those are parameters that are federally required to be monitored. And so over time, the trend was that nothing collected was over some of those standards. So on the lines, as he was showing, there was a lot of those downward trends. If there was ever instance where it was above that, it would have kind of triggered those monitoring equipment to actually stay here. And so that's not what they have found.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we are now, we have a national air toxics trend site. We only have one, and it's in our main South DeKalb monitoring station now. That allows us to kind of monitor at the heart of that area. But it doesn't preclude us. I mean, we have done community scale monitoring for specific projects. It has happened before, but from a regulatory standpoint, you know, EPA's focus is national ambient air quality standards, which as I said, is mostly criteria pollutants that don't include HAPs. Those are guaranteed. That's why we have the two monitors that monitor ozone and PM2.5. Now, with respect to hazardous air pollutants, that's where, you know, we just go by ear. You know, there is no, it's not, there's no monitoring requirement that is comparable to the NACS part, the criteria air pollutants. That's why you see PM2.5 and ozone mostly, because that's where that has been EPA's focus. Now, toxic air pollutants tend to be more of a local than a national issue. And so doing a local study community scale is more adapted to that sort of, if you're trying to get information about that, than doing this national network like we do for ozone, because ozone is typically not local. I mean, it's as local as air toxics typically.
And just to add to, while we're on the discussion of ambient air quality monitoring, we have also been in contact with the staff that oversees the ambient air quality monitoring program with the state.
Yeah.
She's not on this call right now, but
Yeah.
we are communicating with her. There's an air quality monitoring plan, ambient monitoring plan. There's some public participation around that in
Yes.
May. So that's actually going to be coming up. And
but I will say that, you know, I think we do get a lot of requests for people to monitor in their area. And I think people like the idea of monitoring near their area because it is a comforting thing to know that. But I've got to say that monitoring is a very resource intensive thing, and you got to really understand what you're looking for. So if I'm in a neighborhood near Plant Bowen, and I'll definitely want to monitor SO2. If I'm near a battery plant, I will definitely want to monitor for lead. But you got to have kind of a hook to really delve into that and justify that. What we use, the tools we use first are modeling tools. So, and Eric might talk about this, is when we issue a brand new permit for a facility, we do screen for toxics and see, and we run models based on the equipment they have at that facility they're about to build. And then we run those toxic models to do a screening to see what the impact are. And if the impact is high, we mandate additional controls. So that's where our intervention is on the modeling side, because you can cover a lot more sources and get the sources to install the substantive control technology that without going into a long drawn out monitoring exercise that could take years and not really arrive at conclusive, you know, evidence that a facility either emitted or didn't emit. Because remember, once you do monitoring, you're not only catching stuff coming from the facility, you're catching stuff coming from everywhere. And then it becomes an issue. Well, is it coming from the facility? Which way was the wind blowing? It gets complicated pretty quick, which is, I think for people, the focus probably is, hey, let's make sure we have the absolute best controls out there at that facility to minimize any impact, regardless of what the modeling or the monitoring says. Just throwing that out there. I know it's a lot.
No, thank you. I do appreciate that. And I'm just gonna, any other questions for Dika before we go and hand it over to Eric? And of course, there will be a little, as long as we have time, before 12:15, there should be some more time for questions.
Sure.
We good here in person? Sam, you got one? The question is, are there any fines?
Oh, absolutely. A violation of the permit, so Eric's going to talk about how he writes up the permits, issues it to the facility. Any violation of any condition of that permit, you know, which is captured through our inspectors, because we have inspectors, they go out there and inspect, results in a consent order and a fine. So yeah, the facilities can get in the consent order. I mean, there are different escalations. There's notice of violation. There's a consent order, which usually is attached to a penalty. It can go all the way to an administrative order. We have different enforcement mechanisms to compel the facility to comply with its permit. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and scoot on to Eric. If you want to go ahead and screen share and get going. Thank you,
All right.
Dika.
I can do that. Good afternoon, everyone. And Rachel, thank you for giving us an opportunity to speak with y'all today. All right. Are you seeing that? Oh, wait. I'll get it share. Okay.
It's coming, I think.
Yeah. All right.
There it is.
All right. Very good. As Rachel had mentioned, I'm the manager of the stationary source permitting program here at Georgia EPD in the Air Protection Branch. The permitting program is one of 6 programs. And as Dika had mentioned, there's my group that writes those air quality permits for whether it's a brand new factory or some other institution that requires a permit, or if there's a factory or an institution that needs to make a modification. We would also then go back and amend that air quality permit. And we work with the other programs in the air branch. So we write that permit. The compliance program is really the program we are most paired with. And so that would be the inspectors that Dika had mentioned that go to those facilities, inspect the facilities, compare that to the requirements of the permit, and then assess any enforcement that may be there. We also work a lot with, as far as inspectors go, there's also district offices. There's a coastal district office right here in town in Brunswick that handles a lot of our permitted facilities. So I'm going to kind of go through today and talk a little bit about air quality permitting in the state of Georgia. Georgia issues air quality permits. Most states in the country, either a state agency or a city agency will issue those air quality permits, and that's either delegated by US EPA, or in this case we are kind of what's called SIP approved. So EPA is we've got our own plan. EPA approved that years ago, and we just kind of followed that. After we kind of demonstrated to US EPA that what our permitting actions were and what our review was, kind of met those requirements and what they needed. So let's start off today by talking about permitting. As Dika mentioned, I think he had 3,000 or 4,000, 3,000 or 3,400 permits issued in the state of Georgia. Of those 3,500 permitted facilities, I would classify, maybe as Dika mentioned, we have really 3 different groups. Title V, or those are major facilities, and we have around about 350 of those, and then the ones that are smaller, that emit less, we have about 3,000 of those smaller facilities. Those may be called either synthetic miners, true miners, or in some cases we use kind of a government jargon term called permit by rule, which basically just means it's a permit that has taken some pre-established requirements or pre-established conditions to limit those emissions. So who needs a permit? Well, I think, you typically think about an air quality permit, permitted site, and you think about an industrial source, paper mill, manufacturing operation. And those do need air quality permits, but there's actually a lot of facilities you may not think about that would need an air quality permit. Institutions, a lot of hospitals actually have permits. A lot of times they'll have a bunch of emergency generators or a big boiler on site, or a small boiler on site that may require a permit. Obviously, for something like a hospital, you would want to make sure that you have power in any circumstance. So those emergency generators may need a permit. Similarly, a lot of colleges have air quality permits, University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, even some smaller colleges. They'll have, their infrastructure consists of a lot of boilers, kind of same thing to heat the buildings, as well as those emergency generators. Military bases, obviously, we're close by Fort Stewart, and very large, really like its own city, and they have an air quality permit. Also landfills, you usually think about a landfill as being related to solid waste, but they have air quality permits really related to, to kind of methane and some of the other emissions there. All right, so what is a permit? I think in some people's view, a permit is considered a permission to emit or just a permission to pollute. I don't really use that term. A permit is something that establishes the rules and regulations that apply. There's state rules, state standards for a variety of industries. There's also federal regulations out there as well. And they're usually broken down by industry type. So you've got a regulation that governs, like I mentioned, boilers, a regulation that governs automobile painting or aircraft painting and things of that nature. So those requirements would go into that permit. Georgia issues permits if there's reasonable evidence that a facility can comply with the permit and with any regulations that would need to be in there. So that's really what a permit does, is it's where we kind of said, hey, we think they can comply, lists out those regulations, and also contains if those regulations, if those emission standards, whether it's a state or federal standard, do not really have a very prescriptive method for demonstrating compliance, that's what that permit does. So we have some standard where you're limited to 1 pound per ton of material you produce. That permit would then go in and establish methodology to ensure practical, that standard is practically enforceable. That there's methods that you can really demonstrate that you're in compliance with that. So it's a much more of a yay or nay type situation. As Dika had mentioned, we also use permits to kind of establish the emissions inventory for any given area. All right, so does everybody need a permit? Not everything needs a permit, obviously. Around Georgia, we have in our established rules kind of a threshold on a tons of emissions per year basis. And so this is broken down to tons of emissions per each of those criteria pollutants that Dika had mentioned, as well as those hazardous air pollutants as well. So in the state of Georgia, outside of Metro Atlanta, really, if you were the facilities that have emissions of 50 tons per year of carbon monoxide, may not need a permit. That would include everything at the site. And this is potential emissions where you're assuming there's no pollution control equipment and you assume it's operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we have a threshold of kind of annualized emission thresholds. NOx is 20 tons. Dika had mentioned ozone. So ozone, once again, is not typically emitted directly from a factory or a stack. It's usually created in the atmosphere via a recipe of volatile organic compounds, nitrogen, and volatile organic compounds are solvents, organic chemicals that evaporate into the air. So VOC plus nitrogen oxides, the NOx, usually from products of combustion, whether that's from a boiler or an engine, or really a lot of, whether it's an automobile or a lawnmower. Ozone is VOC, NOx plus sunlight. And so we regulate the volatile organic compounds on that. So there's the kind of emissions thresholds for these. I'm not going to go into details on that. If we have questions later on, I'm happy to kind of explain that. Let's see here. Did want to kind of talk about the 3 classes of permitted sources. I kind of touched on this earlier. You got a minor source, and that makes up really the lion's share of the permitted sources here in the state of Georgia. They need a permit, but they are below what's called PSD major source thresholds. And I apologize, doing government work, you use a lot of acronyms. And so PSD is a federal term for permitting program developed by US EPA back in the 70s and modified every few years. It's for permitting of really large facilities. It's prevention of significant deterioration of air quality. It's kind of a mouthful in and of itself. But it is the permitting program for large operations. In this case, we're talking about those facilities that are not subject to that, which is by far the vast majority of factories, industries in the state. These have potential emissions of up to 250 tons per year of those criteria, each of those criteria air pollutants. And that 250 tons per year is a value really established by the feds years ago, and consequently every few years they'll kind of re-examine those rules. So, what do we have that would be, say, an industry that is kind of a minor source? Don't have anything down in the Brunswick area, but up in Metro Atlanta, we have a lot of rock quarries. Landfills, as I mentioned before, those have methane emissions, which kind of a trivia here. Methane is not regulated really as a criteria pollutant. It's not a VOC as defined by EPA, and it is not a HAP. It is a greenhouse gas. Rachel had mentioned some greenhouse gas and a March you're having. So methane is one of those pollutants that contributes to this global warming. Printing operations. This may be a printing press that's making magazines, newspapers, printing on paper and plastic packaging. It could be general manufacturing, whether you're painting automobiles, luxury boats, making boats, things of that nature. So that's really a minor source permit. There's kind of a subcategory of that are, we have something called Title V permitting. So there's really two definitions of major. A Title V permit sometimes is considered major, but there is plenty of cases where you can be subject to Title V, which is a federal permitting requirement, and still be minor under this PSD regulation. All right. Kind of the smaller class I want to kind of touch on was facilities that don't need a permit at all. There are, as Dika had mentioned, there's a lot of contributors out there to kind of ambient levels of emissions and pollution in the air. And not all of those receive an air quality permit. Those are the ones that are below that threshold. A lot of those are schools, a lot of, whether it's a high school, elementary school, small college, they will probably have boilers, generators on site, but those emissions really don't trip that permitting requirement. That being said, there's still a possibility that they are subject to some sort of emission standard, but they just would not need an air quality permit. Restaurants, most public buildings, gas stations for one, there may be regulations that that gas station is subject to, but they would not need an air quality permit. The burden to issue a permit to every gas station in the state would just really not be worth it from a workforce point of view. Another one that we see a lot that I'll touch on in a few minutes is auto body shops. There are regulations that apply to auto body shops. So a lot of times we'll have those registered, but they do not need an air quality permit. Usually their emissions are such that they're below that permitting threshold. If you're curious about this, there's a list of sources that are categorically exempt from permitting. You can find that at epd.georgia.gov. So next we'll talk about PSD major sources. There are really not a whole bunch of these in the state, even though these usually draw a lot of attention. So these are large sources with emissions greater than 250 tons per year. In some cases, that threshold is actually less than 250 tons per year, maybe 100 tons. That's established via federal regulation. So these large facilities, whether they're brand new or if they're making a big change on site, they require kind of special permitting. And so it's would require a little bit closer look and require potentially making sure that whatever they do, whatever expansion they're looking at, doesn't harm the air quality in the area, and that they go really above and beyond to make sure that emissions are minimized. The citation, if you're curious, is under 40 CFR, that's Code of Federal Regulations. All the air quality regulations are under 40 CFR something. In this case, it's 5221. So what are those requirements? I'll touch on that real fast. Really just a case-by-case determination that whatever expansion, whatever they're building, if required and if applicable, they put on really the best air pollution control technology that they can. Other main aspect of major source permitting is that criteria air pollution modeling that Dika had mentioned. This is an air quality analysis where you're using a computer model to demonstrate that the proposed facility is not going to cause or even contribute to a violation of that National Ambient Air Quality Standard, or NAAQS. And so there may be a situation where a factory wants to expand, but if it's going to some place that already has a lot of industry around it, they may not be able to go to really do that because of that modeling result may say, hey, this air shed is really won't allow much more increase. I mentioned that there's a lot of air quality regulations, both state and federal regulations, and those are rolled into a permit if needed. They may still apply even if there's not a permit. So those may be state regulations, and we have a bunch of those, probably about 100 of those maybe. And those are, once again, industry specific, and those may apply to whether it's painting a Coke can, building a Kia automobile, painting a Gulfstream aircraft, making hot mix asphalt to pave the roads. Each one of those has a emission standard that was created through the state of Georgia. And to kind of go along with that, there's a lot of federal regulations, federal emission standards as well. Criteria pollutants are usually regulated under something called new source performance standards. It's 40 CFR subpart 60. Jargon is just NSPS. If it's a HAP or a hazardous air pollutant, those are regulated under what's called the NESHAPs or MACT standards. It's at the maximum achievable control technology or national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants. Those are found in 40 CFR parts 61 and 63. Usually these are standards in pound of emission per ton of material or grain loading out of that exhaust stack. So this is going to give you an example of what that may look like. One of the other aspects that we consider when we're issuing a permit for a new source is health risk. Once again, we want to make sure that whether or not there's a rule out there or emission standard out there that applies to any given factory or any given pollutants, we want to make sure that permit is going to be protective of human health. And so what we do is we have something called the toxic guidelines, where we look at that those toxic air pollutants and oftentimes run an air quality model very similar to the model we use for PSD permitting to ensure that the facility expansion or the facility that is asked for a permit will have result in ambient concentrations of whatever toxic that may be in levels lower than what EPD deems as screening values. What's a screening value is a value that has been established using governmental, whether it's an OSHA standard, oftentimes it's a US EPA value for minimal impact. And we'll make sure that the increase in emissions is below that screening value. Does not include those background concentrations or from neighboring sources. The screening value is set at a fairly conservative level for when a factory goes in place. So real fast, I was going to talk about, before I kind of walk through the process for permitting, I was going to talk about what do we have in Glenn County. So Georgia EPD, we have a database that kind of lists all the facilities we know about kind of on our radar. We have, what I saw when I did this was about 39 operating sources. Those are sources with a specific ID number. After I looked at those a little bit closer, I noticed that a lot of those have an ID number but do not have a permit. And that's going to be the case with a lot of things. I mentioned earlier that an auto body shop is subject to a federal work practice across the country, typically. So they may have a kind of an ID number, but they do not necessarily have a permit. So about 20 facilities actually in Glenn County hold air quality permits, and those are ones that are operating. So what are the big ones we're looking at? I think everybody knows, the usual suspects of kind of the large PSD major sources in Glenn County. We have Brunswick Cellulose, Pinova, McManus is still around on our records. Simrise is a chemical plant. We have a facility that's kind of in the north part of the county that's Georgia Pacific has a sawmill. It's called the Sterling Mill. I think it's temporarily closed right now. So what are some of the sources in Glenn County that are not PSD major? Well, we've got a printing operation at Fort Dearborn, Gulfstream, asphalt plants, just to name a few. Once again, we have about 20 that have permits. It's kind of a map, and this is taken from a tool we have on our web page that we use when we're doing air quality modeling for PSD purposes, and it just helps us identify those large contributors. So it's not necessarily real accurate or real pretty, but I just wanted to kind of point out what we have here. So you've got Simrise down here, kind of in the southern part of the county. The reds are the larger facilities, what they call Title V majors. Pinova, that's over there, kind of in the heart of town. Brunswick Cellulose over on the east side, and then as you move up, McManus right there on the river, and then Sterling kind of as you're headed out of town. We have a similar, just another close up there The blue indicates small, those are smaller facilities, we call synthetic miners. Not real sure what those are, probably the Fort Dearborn, an asphalt plant, Gulfstream, probably up here by the airport. Real fast, I know we're running out of time. I know there's probably some questions. What are the steps? What do we do when we get an air quality permit application? How do we issue these? If the factory wants to propose an air quality permit or a company wants to propose a facility, whether it's a new factory or a modification, they would submit that application to us. That application is going to contain a list of what all their emissions are. It's going to have flow diagrams and maps. It's going to have hopefully a analysis of what regulations may apply. The Georgia EPD makes our own determination on that. Emissions inventory for what the emissions are from that facility. Used based and the reasons why, the basis for those emissions. And once we get that application, we issue something called a public advisory. And this is something that we send out on a weekly basis. Usually I think it goes out on Thursdays. It's an email to those that have subscribed for it. And usually we'll have those kind of a list of those permit applications that we have received during the previous week, where there is either an emissions increase or some sort of substantive change. This public advisory doesn't contain every permit application we get, but addresses those that really involve emissions increases. If it's a name change, we're not going to include it on there. If you're interested in signing up to receive this public advisory weekly email, there's the link right there. So that public advisory allows for 30 days for comments when we receive comments or requests for public hearings, whether it's in opposition or in favor of a new factory or suggestions on people's concerns. What do we do once we, while we're looking at this? Well, the application review is handled by one of my staff. These are engineers. They review the emissions calculations and they make sure that the emissions are both permittable from a standpoint of the right permit category, as well as emission standards. They look at those regulations to make sure that we've captured any applicable regulation that may apply. And kind of the big thing is really developing those conditions, those requirements of that permit that ensure compliance with those limits. Whether it's monitoring conditions, and a monitoring condition maybe, you've got to measure your emissions coming out of your stack on a continuous basis, or the facility has a fume incinerator and they have to require, they have to monitor the temperature of the fume incinerator constantly, and it has to achieve 1,500 degrees, for example. That permit may have requirements for stack testing, where they hire a third party. It comes down and actually test the emissions in person. Permit would also have records requirements for tracking production, tracking those parameters, and reporting as needed. So that's really how a permit would be developed, and then submitted. Would be reviewed by management, issued by the director, and actually put on the web. I forgot to put on here the link to where you can view those permits. But I can send that out if Rachel, you need that. So I guess I'm going to open it up for questions. We don't have a lot of time left, but I want to give anybody a chance to ask about permitting.
Sure, let me check the audience. I haven't seen anything come in the chat.
Talked about the need for third-party verification on data coming out of the stacks. Specifically in Brunswick, say for example, Brunswick cellulose. Okay, as part of their permit, do they have third party monitoring? And how does the public know what's coming out of the stack? And at any given moment, that could change, obviously. So is there recording that tells you, and how often is it being done? And does it have third party verification?
Okay, did you hear that well enough?
I did not know.
Okay, so Sharon, I might need to compartmentalize that because it's a lot for me to try to repeat. So I think that the first part was talking about third-party reporting. And what was the specific question around the third-party reporting specifically?
Okay, so
Sorry. I can only repeat about like 1 or 2 sentences at a time, so.
that'll make it easier.
Yeah, just standing in front of the computer. I'll hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question was about third-party reporting. I heard that and it kind of perked my ears up. Specifically in the case of Brunswick Cellulose in Brunswick, does their permit require third-party reporting? And that's the first question, yes or no?
Oh, when you say reporting, when third-party stack testing, I think is
Third-party verification of their data
right.
on pollutants coming out of their stacks. Does their permit require that?
I don't have their permit in front of me, but knowing what I know about the facility, it probably has a little bit of everything. For a
Okay.
facility that size, a pulp mill, they would have probably periodic scheduled stack testing. So stack testing is when you have a group of folks, and that would be that third party. That would be somebody that you call and hire, somebody that's certified in conducting these stack tests, and they stick a little probe inside the smokestack, follow EPA procedures. EPA has and Georgia's really adopted these, a full, huge list of here's how you do a stack test. So you've got a particulate matter. So there's an EPA test method they have to follow step by step.
Okay.
And this company, the stack testing company, would do that stack test step by step, and then submit those results along with kind of their procedures and their documentation that they did that test following EPA procedures directly to Georgia EPD.
Okay, yeah, I'd be curious to know when that has occurred, how often has it occurred, and what the results were.
Yeah.
So, because I think the public is very interested in knowing what comes out of those stacks at any given moment. And obviously, it's different things at different times because what the public is sensing in terms of air impairment, if you will, is different at different times. So I think there's a great deal of interest in knowing what kind of monitoring there is and what it is. So if that's something that's available, maybe you can let us know how we could get that information.
Okay. And that's a good point. You mentioned that the public perception, or maybe the impacts are different, and that is something I wanted to point out. A stack test is really just going to be it's usually takes place over a week, a day maybe. So a lot of times it may be kind of a snapshot of what the emissions are at that point in time. And one of the things that is so important about a stack test is you're doing the stack test to see how much is coming out. At the same time that say one person is checking those emissions, another person from that team is usually down in the control room making sure and recording or using digitized technology here to record the operating parameters of kind of both the emissions generating piece of equipment and the emissions controlling piece of equipment. I mentioned fume incineration. So you're testing for fumes here, and then at the same time, you're going to be having somebody report or track, okay, during this time, the fume incinerator was operating at 1500 degrees at 115. Oops, now it operated at 116. It was at at $14.95. And then at 1:30, it was at $14.92 or whatever. And so one of the things we do is we kind of correlate those parameters for that pollution control equipment with the results of that stack test. So there are kind of multiple facets to how a permit may ensure compliance with those emission limits.
If for example, you were receiving multiple complaints from the public on a certain date and time, would you be able to correlate those with any sort of data that is available to you? I know that's a big ask, but it's something that I think people are looking to know.
Yeah, and my counterpart in compliance is not on the call, but I would say that a lot of times that's what they do is if there's a complaint, you're usually looking to see, okay, was there an upset condition on that day? Can you correlate a complaint taking place on April 9th with one of those pollution control equipment parameters not being up to snuff on that day?
Right. That would be significant information, I think, for the public to actually know. So.
Right. And I don't want to speak for my compliance counterparts, but I do think that's part of it. And I don't know if Dika, if you want to weigh in on how that may happen, but
Yeah, and I know some of our district office.
And I'm pretty sure that's part of what they do.
Yeah, and maybe some of our district office folks might want to weigh in as well. But I think in a nutshell, really high level is we try to communicate with our district office folks that are on the ground or inspectors, try to retrace, when it happened, call the facility, investigate if there was activities that were unusual that day, maybe look at logs to see if we can explain an upset that might have contributed to that event. So it's kind of an investigation in a way, but with a lot of conversations happening with a lot of different people. How fast that's happening, I think, yeah, it's true that, the quicker we're able to put it all together, the better it is. But there is a lag. By the time, I guess, we get the information and then go back and try to figure out what happened, there's always a little bit of a lag.
So I did let Brett and Bruce, they can like unmute themselves if they want, but before they do that, I do just want to do a little time check. It is after 1:15, so if our speakers, if either of you guys have to go, just kind of giving you an opportunity to politely excuse yourself because we are going over time. But if you have the time for a few extra minutes and questions, we certainly will take it if, just.
Sure, I'll stick around.
Okay. So I've got a question. What are the reporting requirements or maybe monitoring requirements for emergency releases? So we know that a lot of industrial, like manufacturing plants, they have some systems that are pressurized. And in a scenario where the systems become too pressurized, they have an obligation to actually release the pressure. But are there any, air quality monitoring or reporting requirements if in fact they do that?
So, and Dika may have some once again have some thoughts on this as well. But typically, the air quality permit is based on normal operation, and that's usually the way a permit is framed, especially like a permit that's say for a smaller source. Here, I think right now everybody is sort of thinking about these larger sources that are subject to Title V requirements, whether that's Pinova or Brunswick cellulose. Title V permits carry with them some federal requirements that do touch on, I guess, risk, 112R, emergency release, things like that. But a smaller permit would typically not necessarily have that in there. There may be a reporting requirement if there's a release for more than 4 hours, and that is a requirement in our rules. For any major source that has a release that is in excess of a standard, I think that's a 4-hour issue, has to report that within a certain time frame. And Dika, do you have any?
Yeah, I know that there's also, and this is not on the air side, but for accidental releases, there's like a 10-pound threshold to actually, you're forced to report that. And I don't know if it's our emergency response team or some folks that handle that aspect. And I wanted to circle back on something I failed to mention, was that we did pull meteorological data and wind data with some of the odor events that you all experienced there, and using modeling, trying to piece back together where those potentially came from. So using modeling tools and meteorology, which is actually wind direction and speed, we try to recreate what happened on that day based on when we received a complaint and see if we can backtrack where the pollution came from. But it's very, very difficult, but we've tried. Yeah. We're still doing it, but it's ongoing.
I've got another question from the audience here. Can you renew a permit under the Title V program if the facility has been in non-compliance in the past 12 months?
Yes. Yes. So, and that's an interesting point. So a Title V permit, once again, it's a federal program that EPA came out with in 1990 as part of the Clean Air Act amendments. And so Title V permitting applies to large minor sources in some cases, as well as really any PSD source. And one of the provisions of Title V or Part 70 permitting is it has to be renewed every 5 years. That renewal is, for the most part, an opportunity to update the permit to kind of congeal everything back together. If there were some changes, it kind of cleans the permit up. It is opportunity to remove any requirements that no longer apply. If somebody gets rid of a piece of equipment, it also is an opportunity to add in new, recently applicable regulations as well. But it is not not based on compliance at the time. And really, once the facility submits their application on time, according to federal law, they have something called an application shield, which means they've got they submitted their application. If EPD doesn't issue that permit, they are within their right legally to continue operation of their facility under their current permit and until EPD or until a permitting agency issues that new permit.
I agree with Eric. I would just add that if our compliance folks observe equipment that was not permitted on site or things like that, like Eric said, it's an opportunity to clean up the permit and make it better and make it more accurate. But that would be based on what we observed on site, not necessarily based on an enforcement.
Okay, thank you. And I guess that question, I think, kind of stems from the fact that the Georgia Cellulose or Georgia Pacific, sorry, their permit application was received by the Environmental Protection Division this summer, and the renewal notice hasn't been filed yet. And we do know that the facility was in non-compliance for the Clean Air Act last April. And so we were wondering if that was part of the holdup. But your assurances have proved that it's not. So we are anxious to see that permit go through the renewal process down here. Any other questions? Go ahead.
So Rachel, I would say that, so permitting so the permit renewal is really completely decoupled from the enforcement actions that are taking place. There may be some enforcement requirements that would need to go into that Title V renewal. You mentioned timing. Part 70 or Title V, I use those terms interchangeably, has a kind of a statutory deadline of once that application comes in, state agencies have 18 months to issue those renewal permits. And that's, usually, my point of view is we shoot to issue those permits within about a year. Because those are typically a fairly routine permit. We don't try to push those out really, really early. We'd rather take our time to look at those, make sure that we've encapsulated everything that needs to be in there. But I know that we've had some interest in that, and I'm thinking that this renewal will likely get ready to go to public comment sometime in late summer. I know that 5 years ago, kind of the same situation. I think there was some odor complaints. They had a couple things going on down there about 5 years ago, attributed to Brunswick cellulose, and we actually had a public hearing down there. I think in the old courthouse about 5 years ago, just for renewal, and I think we had probably 30 folks down there for that. So it was kind of a similar situation. I don't know if there was a compliance situation where there was non-compliance going on, but I remember there had been a bunch of complaints about some funky smell. I don't remember talking to either talking to Daniel or getting some information from him on this.
Yeah, and if I do remember correctly, the last time Georgia Pacific's permit was up for renewal was actually maybe 6 to 8 months after they had an emergency release that was documented by the Emergency Response Center, and actually one of our high schools had to be evacuated as a result of that release. So it was a pretty bad timing, I think.
Yeah. I remember I can't remember the
that.
term that Daniel used. He had some term for that, what he called that release, that kind of a high density release or something. So. Gosh.
And Eric, we look forward to walking through that permitting process in the summer with you, and certainly we'll reach out in lieu of that if we have any more questions about the permitting program. We could give you a little bit of a round of applause. I know you guys might not be able to hear it, but thank you guys so much. And y'all enjoy the rest of your day.
Lost him there.
Yeah, I think we lost you, but thank you all for having us.
Thank you. Dika did send in the chat a link to the where you can view all those air quality permits on our webpage.
Yes, I see that there, and I'm not sure if y'all can hear me now, but there was okay, good. I don't know. Hopefully you caught your round of applause.
Yeah, I caught some a little bit. Yeah. Thank you all.
All right.
Great weekend.
Thank you.
You too.
Bye-bye.